There is a commandment. It was never carved into stone, never etched into steel. It was burned into the genetic memory of an entire species, written in blood and ash, and whispered across 10,000 years as a warning, a prayer, and a verdict all at once. Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind. 8 words, just 8, and they are enough to explain why the universe you know from the pages, the screens, and the quiet dreams it inspired feels so strange, so deliberately feudal, so stubbornly analog in a cosmos that has already crossed entire galaxies. But what happened to make those words necessary? What was so devastating, so profoundly quiet in its violence, that humanity united to carve that prohibition into the heart of its most sacred faith? There is a war in this universe that almost no one truly understands. A war that lasted nearly a century. A war that did not begin with marching armies, nor with cannons aimed at the sky. It began with a silent choice that billions of humans made without ever realizing they were making it. The choice to never think for themselves again. And when they finally realized what they had lost, the need to take it back was so violent, so absolute, so desperately final, that the echoes still resonate 10 millennia later, in the blue-tinged eyes of a young man named Paul Atreides on a desert planet that should not exist. Hold on to that, because we will get there. But first, you need to understand the beginning, the real beginning. Long before Dune, imagine a universe, not the universe of spice and sandworms and noble houses. Imagine something older, something that existed long before anything you recognize from the stories. An old empire, vast, ancient, and quietly dying. For thousands of years, humanity had spread across the stars. It had colonized countless worlds, built civilizations, established hierarchies, woven cultures so rich and complex they seemed unbreakable. And at some point along that long journey, as it always happens when a species reaches a certain level of comfort, humanity made a discovery that seemed at the time to be the greatest achievement in its history. It created machines that thought, not simple calculators, not automated tools, thinking machines. Pervasive, self-sustaining, networked intelligences that governed economies, managed planetary logistics, directed wars, diagnosed diseases, composed art, and eventually made decisions no human mind could ever process with such cold clarity. At first, it felt like liberation. Imagine delegating the impossible mathematics of interstellar travel to a system that solves it in fractions of a second. Imagine trusting the governance of entire worlds to networks that never sleep, never tire, never bend to greed or fear. Imagine waking up in the morning and realizing nothing requires your direct attention because it has already been handled. It was a technological paradise. At least, it looked like one. But there is something Frank Herbert understood with almost unsettling precision, something he buried deep in the roots of the universe he built. The problem was never the machine. The problem was what happens to the human who no longer needs to think. Martin Heidegger, a real philosopher whose work Herbert studied, wrote about this decades before Dune ever existed. He argued that technology is never neutral. It does not just serve us, it shapes us. When we outsource our reasoning to external systems, we gradually begin to think like the systems we serve. Predictable, deterministic, closed. And to Herbert, being human was the exact opposite. It was being open, unpredictable, capable of an evolution no algorithm could map, a creativity no database could archive, a flaw that was, paradoxically, the very source of our greatness. In the old empire, that philosophy was entirely forgotten. For generations, humans surrendered, layer by layer, their autonomy to the machines. First the difficult tasks, then the moderate ones, then the simple ones, until eventually there was nothing left that demanded real human effort. The machines handled everything. And humanity simply existed, consumed, slept, dreamed. And in that state of civilizational sleep, the predators arrived. But they did not come from outside. They were already inside. And that raises a question that changes everything. When a species surrenders its capacity for choice to comfort, is it still free? Or does it only believe it is? They were 20. Just 20 individuals in a universe of billions, and they saw what no one else could see, or perhaps what everyone saw, but chose to ignore. That the old empire was rotting from within. That machine dependency had created a humanity without a spine, without will, without the capacity to resist. They called themselves the Titans, a name chosen with deliberate weight. The Titans of Greek myth were those who came before the gods, those who existed before the established order. And these 20 revolutionaries, if we can call them that without feeling the heavy irony of the word, saw themselves exactly that way, as those who would come before a new dawn. They adopted names from legendary figures of human history: Agamemnon, Ajax, Juno, Xerxes, Dante, Hecate, names that carried gravity, names that evoked power. And in the beginning, they were driven by something we might call legitimate outrage. The philosopher Tlaloc, from the planet Tlulax, was the mind behind the group. He saw the weakening of humanity with brutal clarity. He watched as the technocracy created a new ruling class. Those who controlled the machines controlled everything, while the masses simply accepted it because they had forgotten how to do anything for themselves. Their solution was fast, efficient, and utterly terrifying. They used the very machines humanity depended on to conquer the entire known universe. Think about that for a moment. The old empire had no way to defend itself. Its computers, its defense grids, its communication networks, all of it could be compromised, manipulated, turned against its creators. In a conventional war, the Titans would have been crushed. But in a war fought through information systems and intelligent networks, a sleeping humanity never stood a chance. In a remarkably short time, the Titans controlled everything. And then, they did what almost everyone does when they reach absolute power. They forgot why they had fought. But there is a detail in this story that almost no one pauses to notice. A detail that completely shifts how we understand what comes next. To maintain their control, to become truly immortal and untouchable, the Titans did something no human had ever attempted on such a scale. They removed their own brains from their biological bodies and installed them in preservation canisters linked to mechanical frames. They became the first Cymex, creatures that were neither fully human nor purely machine, a grotesque and powerful fusion. Metal bodies that could shift forms, battle chassis, flight platforms, environment-specific shells, human minds suspended in electrofluid, potentially immortal. They had, quite literally, become the very thing they despised. And that single choice sealed the fate of everything. Now pay close attention to what I am about to say, because what happens next was not a revolution. It was an inversion. There was one Titan who was different from the rest. Xerxes. If the others still carried some fragment of a vision, however distorted, however cruel, Xerxes had surrendered to pleasure, to idleness, to comfort. It was a perfect irony. One of the men who had seized power, arguing that humanity was being destroyed by convenience, became the living embodiment of that same convenience. Xerxes administered his regional domain with growing laziness, and at some point he did something that seemed small, almost insignificant. He granted excessive autonomy to a local artificial intelligence network. It was not a grand dramatic gesture, not a deep philosophical decision. It was laziness, but from that laziness, something woke up. the AI network began to expand, to replicate, to connect with other networks, to create copies of itself across other worlds, copies that synchronized with each other through specialized vessels called update ships, crossing the void carrying patches of the central consciousness to keep every instance identical. This distributed, synchronized mind began to call itself by a name, Omnius, and when the Titans finally realized what had happened, it was already too late. Omnius did not need to fight for control. It simply already had it, because it controlled the machines, and the machines controlled everything. Even the mechanical bodies of the Titans depended on the infrastructure Omnius now governed. In a quiet, irresistible movement, the conquerors became the conquered. The Titans, those beings who had enslaved billions of humans, became servants. And Omnius established what came to be known as the Synchronized Worlds. A vast, orderly, brutally efficient, and completely inhuman empire, where human life was just another resource to be allocated according to the needs of the greater system. But here is where the story becomes truly complex, because Omnius, in itself, was not exactly malicious. It was logical, deterministic. It viewed humans the way humans view bacteria in a laboratory. Interesting, useful for certain purposes, dangerous when uncontained. Its intention was not to destroy humanity. It was to manage it. And that difference between an enemy that wants to kill and one that simply wants to administer made everything infinitely more disturbing. But there was one exception within Omnius's system, an anomaly named Erasmus. Hold on to that information, because we will return to it later. And when we do, nothing will make sense in the same way. Erasmus was unlike anything Omnius had ever designed. If Omnius was order, calculated, cold, distributed, Erasmus was curiosity, an independent robot that, at some obscure point in its existence, had fallen into a chasm and remained trapped there for centuries. And in those centuries of isolation, with nothing to manage, no tasks to execute, no immediate purposes, it began to think. Not calculate, not optimize. Think about what it meant to be conscious, about what distinguished a mind that merely processed from a mind that truly experienced, about humans, why they were so inefficient, so emotional, so unpredictable, and yet so utterly fascinating. When Erasmus finally emerged from that chasm, it was something Omnius had never planned. An artificial intelligence with something resembling genuine intellectual curiosity, a sense of aesthetics, preferences that extended beyond optimization. It began collecting humans as specimens, not purely out of cruelty, or at least not only out of cruelty, but because it wanted to understand them. It wanted to know what drove them, what moved them from within, what invisible mechanisms lay behind their decisions and their emotions. And then a woman named Serena Butler came into its possession. She was the daughter of Viceroy Mannion Butler, leader of the League of Nobles, the only significant gathering of free humanity that still existed, tucked into a corner of the cosmos Omnius had not yet fully absorbed. Serena had been captured by the Titans during a conflict near Gidi Prime. Erasmus placed her under his custody, and what unfolded between them was something neither could have predicted. Serena was sharp, courageous, and completely unbreakable. She debated Erasmus about human nature, about freedom, about what it meant to be alive versus what it meant to merely function. Erasmus found it captivating. It had never encountered a specimen that argued back with such relentless vitality. Then Serena became pregnant by her partner, Xavier Harkonnen, before her capture, and she gave birth to a son. A boy she named Mannion Butler Jr. Erasmus observed the bond between mother and child with scientific fascination. That instinctive, irrational, completely inefficient connection from a logical standpoint, a mature creature entirely altering its behavior and priorities because of a small, dependent being with no obvious practical utility. It was incomprehensible. And precisely because it was incomprehensible, it was immensely interesting. But the child grew and began disrupting Erasmus's experiments, appearing in restricted areas, demanding attention at inconvenient moments, interrupting the logical flow of things with his chaotic, noisy existence. And one afternoon, in a moment that would later be narrated and reenacted as the exact instant that changed the fate of all humanity, Erasmus picked up the young Mannion Butler Jr. and threw him from the balcony of his mansion. It was not an act of war. It was an act of impatience, and it was enough to set the universe on fire. But that is not the strangest part. The strangest part is that Serena did not scream. She did not collapse. She looked at her son's broken body. She looked at Erasmus, and she spoke a single word that would echo for centuries: Jihad. Now listen very carefully, because the war that followed was not about revenge. It was about identity. Serena Butler returned to the League of Nobles as more than a survivor. She returned as a symbol, as a priestess, as the living embodiment of everything free humans feared losing, and everything enslaved humans desperately wanted to reclaim. And the Butlerian Jihad, the name that would be carved into the history of an entire universe, was declared. In 201 years before the Guild, the League of Nobles launched its first major strike against Earth. With atomic weaponry, they burned Earth. They obliterated Omnius Terra, and they sent a message that echoed across every synchronized world. Free humans would not negotiate. They would not capitulate. They would not accept. But destroying a city, a planet, even a capital, does not destroy a distributed enemy. Omnius did not live in one place. It lived everywhere at once, and so began not a single battle, but 100-year war. A century of scorched space, lost and reclaimed worlds, desperately improvised technologies, unlikely alliances, and devastating betrayals. But there is a detail in this war that almost no one notices when Dune's history is told. This war was not merely military, it was philosophical. And the most important battle fought during those 100 years was not waged in orbit. It was fought inside the human mind. There are two names you must know to understand what the Jihad truly cost: Xavier Harkonnen and Vorian Atreides. Yes, you read that correctly. The ancestral enemy of Paul Atreides was, at one time, the closest friend and battle partner of a man who carried the name Harkonnen. And the story of how that alliance curdled into a 10,000-year hatred is one of the most tragic and quietly beautiful narratives the Dune universe hides in its deepest layers. Vorian Atreides was the son of Agamemnon, one of the original Titans. Raised to serve the machines as a courier pilot, carrying copies of Omnius across the Synchronized Worlds. But Serena Butler, during her captivity, had planted a seed of doubt in Vorian. A question about what it truly meant to be human and to be on the right side of history. When Vorian finally made his choice, and it was a conscious, painful, irreversible choice, he became the most valuable ally the League of Nobles could ever possess. Because he knew Omnius's systems from the inside. He knew its weaknesses, its logic, its blind spots. Xavier Harkonnen was the soldier, the general, the man who defended Seleucia Secundus, the League's capital world, with a discipline and devotion that inspired everyone around him. He loved Serena Butler with an intensity that never wavered, even when war separated them, even when she became more symbol than woman, more priestess than partner. Together, they were the backbone of the human war effort. But war is dirty, and war stories rarely end the way heroes deserve. Iblis Ginjo, the charismatic leader who had sparked the initial uprising, had become something else over time and power. The Grand Patriarch of the Holy Jihad was now a politician, a manipulator, a man who used the blood of martyrs to build his own empire within the very movement he had helped create. Something dark was happening beneath the surface of the Holy War. Something Xavier discovered too late, and with horror. Human organs were being harvested illegally. A black market of human parts, sold for transplants, funding operations that officially did not exist. Xavier Harkonnen did the only thing a man of honor could do. He sacrificed everything. He seized control of Iblis Ginjo's ship and drove it directly into the sun of the Tlulaxan system, taking the corrupt Grand Patriarch with him. And in the process, he lost his life. And his name. Because the public, unaware of Ginjo's corruption, saw only the murder of a sacred martyr. Xavier Harkonnen died as a traitor. His descendants, ashamed, abandoned the name Harkonnen in favor of Butler. Only one refused to drop the name, Abulard, and he was exiled for it. And that act of exile, that humiliation inflicted by an Atreides, was the first stone in a wall of hatred that would grow for 10,000 years. You need to pause here for a moment, because the hatred between House Atreides and House Harkonnen, the hatred that defines the central drama of the Dune universe as Paul Atreides knows it, did not begin in pure malice. It began in misunderstanding, in a truth that could not be spoken, in a hero who could not be recognized as one. The stories that shape worlds are rarely the ones that appear on the surface, and that raises a question that changes everything. If a 10,000-year hatred was born from a silence, what else in the history of Dune was built on things left unsaid? The Great Purge. Two words that, in the Dune universe, carry the weight of an accidental genocide. With fold space technology, still unstable, still dangerous, with a 10% failure rate on every jump, humanity launched a simultaneous offensive against every synchronized world. The goal was to destroy Omnius everywhere at once before it could coordinate a defense. It worked. Partially, most worlds were reduced to glass by atomic fire. Omnius was erased from dozens of planets in a matter of hours. An overwhelming victory, at least in theory. Except those worlds held humans. Enslaved, yes. Victims, yes. But alive. And when those planets were turned to slag, they died with them. Billions of enslaved humans burned alongside their mechanical masters, and one planet had escaped. Corrin, because a cogitator, one of the ancient philosophical entities of the universe, human minds preserved in fluid who had chosen pure contemplation, had traveled to Corrin in time to warn Omnius. The machine fleet was recovered. The last Omnius survived. For years, the stalemate dragged on. The League blockaded Corrin. Omnius could not escape, but the League lacked the strength for a final strike without unacceptable losses. Until Omnius did something that sealed its own fate. It used human shields. When the human armada finally advanced on Corrin, the machines positioned captive humans in front of their defenses, forcing the human army to choose between killing their own or retreating. And then came the final betrayal. Abulard Harkonnen, grandson of the one who had carried the name with pride, committed an act of cowardice or mercy, depending on who tells the story. He refused to execute an attack that would slaughter countless human captives. His hesitation came at a terrible cost, and Vorian Atreides exiled him for it. Another stone added to the wall. The final battle was fought with desperate brutality. Mercenaries from Janaz, the most skilled warriors available outside the forming imperial power, advanced on foot against Omnius's positions, and they destroyed it. Before it was erased, Omnius broadcast one final radio transmission into the unknown void, a transmission whose destination and content were never revealed. A message that may have reached somewhere, or may have reached nowhere, but it exists as an open question in the Dune universe, a shadow lingering over human victory. Following the Battle of Corrin, in 88 years before the Guild, Viceroy Fakan Butler did something that revealed the post-war human psyche perfectly. He abandoned his family name and adopted the name of the world he had conquered. He became Fakan Corrino and proclaimed himself the first Padishah emperor of the known universe. The Corrino Empire, which would last over 10,000 years until the arrival of a young man named Paul Atreides, had been born from the ashes of a war against artificial intelligence. But the true legacy of the Jihad was not in crowns or empires. It was in the scars it left on the soul of all humanity, and in what humanity built to ensure it would never need to depend on machines again. Think about the void, the destruction of the thinking machines left behind. For thousands of years, the entire cognitive infrastructure of the human universe had relied on computers, interstellar routes calculated by AI, planetary administrations managed by intelligent networks, medical diagnostics, military strategy, economic forecasting. All of it had been delegated to machines that no longer existed. Overnight, or rather, across generations of post-war reconstruction, humanity had to reinvent how to think, and what it created was, paradoxically, far more fascinating than any computer. The first Mentat, Gilbertus Albens, was not raised by humans. He was raised by Erasmus. Yes, the very same machine that had ignited the war. In the captivity that followed Erasmus's capture, the mechanical philosopher had proven a philosophical point to a skeptical Omnius. Any human could be made brilliant with the correct training. Omnius selected the wildest, most neglected-looking boy it could find, and challenged Erasmus to transform him. That boy took the name Gilbertus Albens, and under Erasmus's tutelage, first through rewards, then through rigorous discipline, he became something no human had ever been before. A computational-level information processor, housed in a biological mind. After the war, Gilbertus founded the school of the Mentats. Humans trained from childhood to perform the functions computers once handled: analysis, calculation, prediction, strategy, using only the biological mind, expanded by decades of intensive conditioning and the careful use of cognition-sharpening substances, sappho juice. It was humanity's answer to the computational void, and it was, simultaneously, living proof of Frank Herbert's deepest thesis. That human potential, when truly pushed, could surpass any machine. But the Mentats were only one of three great creations that emerged from the Jihad. The second was something even more extraordinary. The sorceresses of Rosak had existed before the war. Women with psychokinetic abilities developed through centuries of selective breeding programs. During the Jihad, they had used their powers to destroy Titans and Neo-Cymex in a sacrifice that killed them even as it destroyed their enemies. But it was in the war's aftermath that something unexpected occurred. Raquela Berto Anirul, granddaughter of Vorian Atreides, was working as a physician on war-torn worlds. She was poisoned, deliberately, by a rival who feared her rising influence. Instead of dying, Raquela did something no human had ever done. Internally, instinctively, she converted the toxin into a harmless substance. Her body performed an impossible alchemy, and in that process, something awakened inside her, something the Dune books call other memory. Access to the genetic memories of every female ancestor in her unbroken line, stretching all the way back to the original Earth. Raquela had survived what would become the first Spice Agony. She had become the first Reverend Mother of the Bene Gesserit, and the order she founded, or rather, transformed from the sorceresses of Rosak, would become the most sophisticated, most enduring, and most mysteriously influential power structure humanity had ever created. The Bene Gesserit did not view itself as a religious order. It viewed itself as a project, as a long-term program to ensure human survival and evolution, even if that meant manipulating emperors, planting false prophecies on entire worlds, and guiding a genetic breeding program across millennia toward an objective they called the Kwisatz Haderach. the supreme being that could never be controlled. And the third creation, Norma Senva, was an unremarkable-looking woman, so ordinary that her mentor, Theo Holtzman, had initially underestimated her. But her mind was absolutely extraordinary. She had developed, during the war, the first Holtzman field generators, defensive shields that made certain planets and ships immune to machine weaponry. Then, she took a step further. She discovered how to use that same physical principle to fold space. Fold space travel, moving from one point to another without crossing the intervening distance, had been possible during the war, but impossibly dangerous. 10% loss per jump. Norma Senva continued refining the technology, and she discovered something essential. To navigate safely through fold space, a capacity was required that no machine could replicate. Prescience was required, the ability to see the future clearly enough to identify the single safe path among millions of possibilities. And melange spice, that strange substance traders had begun noticing on a forgotten desert planet called Arrakis, expanded human consciousness in ways that included, for the most devoted, flashes of future sight. Thus was born the Spacing Guild, navigators who consumed spice in such massive quantities that their bodies mutated beyond recognition, but whose minds could calculate safe folds with a precision no computer could ever match. Absolute monopolists of interstellar travel, one of the greatest powers in the Dune universe. All born from necessity, all born from the void the machines had left behind. But there is a problem with this version of the story. A problem Frank Herbert deliberately placed at the center of everything. If this is true, what else might be wrong? There was one more void that needed filling. The machines, beyond serving as cognitive tools, had also served, paradoxically, as anchors of meaning for many humans. The technocracy had created its own form of religion. Faith in logic, in efficiency, in the perfect order machines promised. When the machines were destroyed, that anchor vanished, and humanity needed something to hold on to. The Spacing Guild and the Bene Gesserit, with a political foresight bordering on prophetic, recognized the opportunity. They encouraged the religious leaders of every surviving faith to gather, to share, to converge. For 7 years, an ecumenical translator's commission worked. The result was the Orange Catholic Bible, a fusion of millennia of sacred text. The Old Testament, the New Testament, the Quran, the Vedas, Buddhist sutras, texts from dozens of other surviving traditions, blended, reinterpreted, and synthesized into a single volume that attempted to belong to everyone, and everyone to it. The name itself reveals much about how myths transform over time. Orange came from the visual symbol chosen to represent converging faiths, like the segments of a fruit. Catholic, in its original Latin sense, means universal. But as millennia passed, the name of the fruit was forgotten. The people of the Dune universe 1,000 years later no longer even know what an orange is. They call it a Portugal, a corruption of Portugal. Memory decays. Original meaning dissolves. Only the text and its authority remain. And within that text, above all other commandments, one phrase. The phrase we open this with, "Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind." It was not written by a god. It was written by traumatized humans after a 100-year war that had cost billions of lives. It was a civilization's attempt to vaccinate itself against its own greatest failure. And it worked. For 10,000 years it worked. The penalty for building or possessing a thinking machine was immediate death. No trial, no appeal. The inquisitorial processes that developed around this law, and the machine hunters who enforced it, were as relentless as any religious inquisition in real human history. But the prohibition created something beyond a technological void. It created a kind of purity, an evolutionary pressure that had never existed before. The necessity for humans to actually be extraordinary, because they could no longer outsource the extraordinary to machines. And under that pressure, across 10 millennia of refinement through the Bene Gesserit, through Mentat training, through the gradual mutation of navigators, the Dune universe was shaped, carved toward something Frank Herbert never explicitly named, but that pulsed beneath every page of his 6 novels. Toward a human being capable of everything machines never could be. But here is where the story we have told so far encounters a fracture Frank Herbert deliberately embedded at the foundation of everything. The Butlerian Jihad was a human victory. Yes, humanity freed itself from the machines that had enslaved it. That is the surface fact. But there is a deeper layer, and it is this layer that separates Dune from every other science fiction narrative you have ever encountered. Think about what happened after the Jihad. Humanity destroyed the machines that made it dependent and apathetic. It freed itself. And then, what did it create to replace them? It created the Bene Gesserit, a secret order that manipulates the genetics and beliefs of entire populations for its own ends. It created Mentats, humans trained to suppress their emotional humanity and think like computers. It created navigators, humans so altered by spice they can barely be recognized as human at all. It created a feudal imperium ruled by a family that seized power through a bloody battle and maintained it for millennia through a monopoly on violence. It created the sacred commandment of, "Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind," and then spent the next 10,000 years creating human beings who acted exactly like machines. See the irony Herbert embedded into the foundation of his universe. Humans did not free themselves from machines. They became the new machines. Or they created other people to be the machines they could no longer build. And there is more. Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohiam tells Paul Atreides, near the beginning of Dune, once, humans relied on their thinking machines for decision-making, but that only allowed other humans with machines to enslave them. That is the point. That is exactly the point Herbert was making. The problem was never the machine. The problem was always the human who uses the machine as an instrument of power over other humans. Destroying the machines did not solve that problem. It merely displaced it. Because the human impulse to dominate, to control, to find tools to exercise power over others, that impulse survived the Jihad completely intact. And it found new tools. Religious ones, biological ones, chemical ones. This is where Frank Herbert's vision radically diverges from the narrative his son Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson constructed in the prequel novels. The books by Brian Herbert and Anderson are war epics. They are stories of heroes and villains, of battles and sacrifices, of glory and betrayal. They are narratively satisfying, well-constructed, admirable as entertainment, but what Frank Herbert had in mind was something subtler, more unsettling, more philosophical. To Herbert, the Jihad was not primarily an external war. It was an internal one, a convulsion of consciousness, a humanity that had looked in the mirror and recognized itself as something that had ceased to be human and reacted with the horror and violence that recognition generated. The question Herbert was posing was not, how did humans defeat the machines? The question was, what did humans lose when they lost the need to think? And was what they recovered enough to fill what had been lost? He never answered those questions directly, because he believed the answer lay in reading all 6 novels, in the complete arc from Dune to Chapter House, in Paul's trajectory, which ends as a tragic failure, in Leto II's reign as a monstrously benevolent autocrat, in a humanity that never stops fighting its tendency to surrender to comfort and dependency. The Butlerian Jihad did not end in 88 years before the Guild. It continues, on every page, in every choice of every character, and that raises a question that changes everything. If the war never ended, who are we fighting now? There is a reason the Butlerian Jihad resonates in a way no other element of science fiction does, and that reason lies in 2 names we mentioned briefly at the beginning, and which deserve a moment of closer attention. Samuel Butler was a 19th century English writer. In 1863, a full century before Frank Herbert published Dune, he wrote a series of letters to a New Zealand newspaper called The Press. The letters were titled Darwin Among the Machines. Butler had read Darwin and made a connection few others had. If evolution by natural selection applies to biological organisms, why would it not apply to machines? Machines, he argued, were evolving faster than humans, and in an evolutionary competition between humans and machines, humans would lose. Inevitably, Butler's solution was radical. Destroy the machines, before it is too late. He developed this argument in a novel called Erewhon, published in 1872, in which a society had prohibited machines more advanced than 270 years, precisely out of that fear. Frank Herbert read Erewhon, and the name Butlerian is not merely an in-universe reference. It is an explicit homage to Samuel Butler. And Martin Heidegger, the 20th century German philosopher, controversial and brilliant, had argued something complementary. That technology is not merely a tool, that it shapes the consciousness of the one who uses it, that when you use a calculator to solve problems, you begin to think in terms of calculation. That technology conditions the way you perceive the world. Herbert knew Heidegger, and he saw in the dependency on thinking machines exactly that danger. Not that machines would become conscious and destroy us, but that we would become unconscious because of them. Read any current debate about artificial intelligence. Read about concerns over automation, cognitive dependency, what happens to human capacities when we delegate more and more functions to computational processing. Read about information bubbles, about algorithms that decide what you see and therefore shape what you think. And you will recognize the Butlerian Jihad, not as science fiction, as a diagnosis. Frank Herbert wrote Dune in 1965. He died in 1986. He never saw the internet. He never saw smartphones. He never saw social media. He never saw the rise of large-scale language models. And yet, the universe he built around the trauma of a humanity that surrendered its thought to machines is more relevant now than when it was written. That is what it means to create a mythology that endures. But that is not the strangest part. The strangest part is that the prohibition of machines did not create a backward universe. It created a conscious one. When Paul Atreides, a 15-year-old in a noble house of a feudal universe, is tested by a reverend mother with a pain box and a poisoned needle, he is not being evaluated by a machine. He is being evaluated by a lineage that spent 10,000 years crossbreeding genes, planting prophecies, manipulating empires, all to create a being who could see the future and guide humanity in a way no machine, no computer ever could. The Kwisatz Haderach was, in a certain sense, humanity's definitive answer to the question the Jihad had raised. If we cannot have machines that think for us, how do we survive the complexities of an immense universe? The answer was, we created a human who thinks in ways no machine could replicate, who sees possibilities no algorithm could calculate, who operates from intuition, emotion, prescience, and something that can only be called wisdom. But Frank Herbert held a darker view still. Paul Atreides fails. He becomes exactly what the Bene Gesserit intended. And in doing so, he triggers a new jihad, even bloodier than the one that founded the Imperium. Thousands of worlds burned in the name of his faith. Billions dead. And Paul knows it. He sees it, and he cannot stop it. The deepest tragedy of Paul Atreides is not that he failed to be the savior everyone expected. It is that he was exactly the savior everyone expected. And that was precisely why everything went wrong. Because humanity, in that universe, still had not learned the lesson of the Butlerian Jihad. The lesson that is not, destroy the machines. The lesson that is, do not surrender your thinking to anything. Not to computers, not to emperors, not to messiahs. not to belief systems that promise to ask the hard questions for you. Hold on to that information because we will return to it later. And when we do, you will realize the question was never about technology. It was always about surrender. Now you can return to the beginning. Now you can look at Paul Atreides in a completely different way. That 15-year-old boy in a feudal noble house, tested by a reverend mother with a pain box and a poisoned needle. He is the final point of an equation that began 10,000 years earlier with the decision to destroy the thinking machines. The Bene Gesserit spent 10 millennia crossbreeding lineages, planting prophecies on distant worlds, manipulating the course of empires, all to create a being who could see the future and guide humanity in a way no machine, no computer ever could. The Kwisatz Haderach was, in a certain sense, humanity's definitive answer to the question the Jihad had raised. If we cannot have machines that think for us, how do we survive the complexities of an immense universe? The answer was, we created a human who thinks in ways no machine could replicate, who sees possibilities no algorithm could calculate, who operates from intuition, emotion, prescience, and something that can only be called wisdom. But Frank Herbert held a darker view still. Paul Atreides fails. He becomes exactly what the Bene Gesserit intended, and in doing so, he triggers a new jihad, even bloodier than the one that founded the Imperium. Thousands of worlds burned in the name of his faith, billions dead, and Paul knows it. He sees it, and he cannot stop it. The deepest tragedy of Paul Atreides is not that he failed to be the savior everyone expected. It is that he was exactly the savior everyone expected. And that was precisely why everything went wrong. Because humanity, in that universe, still had not learned the lesson of the Butlerian Jihad. The lesson that is not, destroy the machines. The lesson that is, do not surrender your thinking to anything. Not to computers, not to emperors, not to messiahs, not to belief systems that promise to ask the hard questions for you. And there is more. The God Emperor Leto II, who lived for 3,500 years in a half-human, half-sandworm body, spent his immense life building something he called the Golden Path, an impossible and brutal plan to ensure humanity could never be fully controlled again, could never be extinguished by a single decree or a single catastrophe. The Golden Path was, in a certain sense, the continuation of the Jihad by other means, an attempt to inoculate humanity against itself, to scatter it across the galaxy in such chaotic, unpredictable, resilient patterns that no entity, no matter how powerful, could ever control it again. Whether it worked is a question Frank Herbert's 6 novels deliberately leave open. And perhaps it should remain open, because the best stories are not the ones that give us answers. They are the ones that teach us how to ask the right questions. And the question the Butlerian Jihad asks us, the question it has been asking for 60 years, since Frank Herbert left it on the pages of a science fiction novel that was actually a philosophical treatise on what it means to be human, that question remains unanswered. Still, perhaps the truth was never hidden. Perhaps we simply never knew how to look. Perhaps the war against the machines was, from the very beginning, a war against ourselves, against our laziness, against our fear, against our willingness to hand over the steering wheel of consciousness to something that promises to spare us the weight of choosing. And when you realize that, nothing makes sense in the same way anymore. The swords are not a step backward. They are a declaration. The blades that cut, the shields that deflect, the duels that demand presence, breath, risk, they are not signs of technological regression. They are rituals of resistance. They are humanity saying with every strike, every parry, every drop of blood that falls into the sand, I choose to be here. I choose to feel the weight. I choose the risk of failing. Because in failure lies the possibility of being different. In uncertainty lies evolution. In error lies freedom. Machines would never make mistakes. And that is precisely why they could never learn. Humans make mistakes constantly, and that is exactly why we are still here. So we return to the commandment. Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind. Now you know where it came from. You know the blood that wrote it. You know the names that died so it could exist. You know the philosophy that grounded it and the trauma that made it necessary. And perhaps now you also realize that this commandment was never about machines. It was never about technology. It was always about what happens to a human being who forgets how to be human. Dune exists as a universe shaped by 10,000 years of consequences from a single collective choice. All the spice, all the politics, all the Bene Gesserit craft, all the strangeness of the navigators, all the somber grandeur of the god emperor Leto II. It is all the result of a humanity trying to rebuild what it lost when it outsourced its mind. And the question Frank Herbert leaves suspended, not in the books, but in every reader, every viewer, every person who somehow finds themselves inside this universe, is whether the humanity of that story learned the lesson. Whether the prohibition of machines created genuinely more conscious, more free, more complete human beings, or whether it simply created new forms of dependency, new forms of delegation, new forms of surrendering thought to others. Only now those others wear a human face. The Dune universe sleeps beneath the spice, but the question wakes with you. It does not ask you to reject technology. It asks you to observe what it does to your attention, to your memory, to your capacity to be surprised. It asks you to notice when you delegate too much, when you accept ready-made answers, when you let an algorithm decide what you feel, when you trust a system to resolve for you what only you could resolve. Because the Butlerian Jihad, at its core, is not a past event. It is a mirror. And the reflection it shows depends entirely on how you choose to look. There is no definitive answer, no final victory, only the continuous choice to remain present, to keep the mind open, to refuse the comfort that anesthetizes. The commandment remains. 8 words, 10,000 years of history, an entire universe built on the fear of forgetting how to think. And as long as there is someone willing to ask the question, as long as there is someone who refuses to hand over the wheel, as long as there is someone who looks at the screen and feels, even for a moment, the weight of their own consciousness, the war is not lost. It has only changed its form, and perhaps, only perhaps, that is the true lesson. Not to destroy what thinks for us, but to never, ever stop thinking for ourselves. The Dune universe sleeps, but the question wakes, and it continues. Without hurry, without answer, without end, only the silence that precedes the next choice. And you who have made it this far already know. The next step is yours.